Welcome to World of Stories, a podcast about how stories shape our lives. I'm Eileen, and my pronoun is she.
I'm Margaret, and my pronoun is they.
Hi, Margaret.
Hi, Eileen.
How's it going?
All's well, and I hope everyone listening to us is well too. Eileen, do you want to tell us a little bit about your awesome new project?
Sure. So I've started a new project called Queer of Color, and it's a safe space for queer people of color, such as myself, to tell our stories on our own terms. And you can go to queerofcolor.ca, that's color with a U, the Canadian spelling, to check out some of the amazing stories of queer people of color doing really cool things. And yeah, there's also social media accounts you can follow too, but you can find all of that information on queerofcolor.ca.
That's amazing. And how did you find working on a new project during the pandemic?
Well, it was both easy and hard. Easy because, like I mentioned in our last episode, I quit my day job, so I have a lot more time to do my own thing, but it's also hard because with the pandemic and the lockdown, it's been really hard to meet up with the people that I want to interview. And that's kind of what we wanted to talk about today, too. What does it look like to labor and be productive in a pandemic? So, as we were thinking about this topic, I was reflecting that for me, ever since I started working after undergrad, I've always worked the 9 to 5 in an office setting. And so there was always a very clear distinction between when I was at work and when I was off work. And as long as I spent, X number of hours in the office, I supposedly was productive, or at least I felt like I was being productive. And then I had permission to then not work when I left the office.
And do you find that's changed now, that you don't give yourself permission to stop working?
I don't at all. I'm working for myself. I'm working from my home. So there's no clear boundary between what is work and what is not work. And I find that I'm actually getting really anxious that I'm not working enough because these days I, take more breaks from my computer. I'm running errands in the middle of the workday, or I have meetings at night, and I'm finding that it's very hard to track how many hours I'm working. That's, that obviously that's assuming that number of hours is a good or healthy or appropriate measure for how much work I'm doing. But, the thing is, I've read studies that office workers are really only productive for like 3 hours out of the 8 that they spend in the office. And so when I say I've worked in the office for 8 hours, that's not actually true, right? I've definitely spent the entire day in the office sitting at my desk doing absolutely nothing but online shopping and surfing the internet. And so I wasn't productive for those 8 hours. I was wasting time. But, now that I'm working for myself, suddenly I expect myself to be productive and actually doing work for a full 8 hours. And so I'm thinking, maybe that's not very fair to myself to hold myself to that kind of standard because I was never that productive before.
Right. And that makes a lot of sense to me, actually, because I've always set my own schedule. And for example, as a graduate student doing research, I had to manage my time and my huge research project and find ways to achieve my goals by breaking them down. And so, when you think of it, a dissertation is a huge thing when you look at it as a whole, but I had a strategy where I set out proposals to conferences, which would mean that I had to draft a paper to present, and then I had to rework it into a chapter. So I kind of started by tricking myself, and then I learned how to manage my own deadlines and not waste all my time procrastinating. I still feel like I'm a procrastinator, but at least I managed to do things along the way too. And I think that's it's very clear that those studies are true, that we can't just work nonstop for any given time.
Mm-hmm.
But now, during the pandemic, with its intensified virtual connections, it makes me feel like I'm under surveillance a lot more in a very sort of Ford factory way.
Mm-hmm.
where sometimes I have to keep track of my hours, which is impossible since, most of my work takes place in my head. While I'm doing other stuff like walking or cooking, I'm asking myself, how do I teach that? Or do I want to teach the other thing? Or how do I write that? And so on and so forth.
Yeah, I find this idea of tracking really interesting because, right now you are being asked to track hours because that's so ingrained in our capitalist society, right? To measure work by the number of hours. And that's kind of what I was just talking about earlier because with my day job and the number of hours I'm spending in the office. And so for me, this raises the question of, is there another way to measure work or productivity? And what I've actually started doing is I'm calling it a things that I did today tracker in my calendar. And it's just a note where I list everything I've done that day: work things, meetings, calls with friends, cooking meals, errands, even like laundry. And it's a way of demonstrating to myself that, yes, I am being productive, even if I'm sitting in my PJs in bed all day. It helps me feel a little bit less guilty because, my default mode is, Eileen, you're being unproductive and unmotivated and you're lazy. So when I look at a list of all the things that I've done in a day, it helps myself to disabuse myself of those like negative and self-deprecating thoughts.
Right. And I love this things I did today approach. And, uh, you know, uh, it's funny how we laugh at your puritanical approach to work, where you're supposed to work all the time, and when you're not working, then you're lazy. But I do use a similar thing where I keep track of my to-do list daily and weekly. So every day in my journal, I have what I'm reading, what I'm listening to, because I've always got like umpteen books on the run, and what I need to do. And I mostly started it because I love the feeling of putting down the check mark at the
Mm-hmm,
end of the
mm-hmm.
day. But you're right that the side effect is that putting down stuff on paper takes it out of our heads, which then gives me space in my brain to tackle the actual doing of things.
Yeah, that's so true. In so many areas of life, is when you write things down, then it's like it physically leaves your body almost, right? Um, and the thing about capitalism, and I'm really, really starting to hate capitalism, but like the one thing it does is that it tells us that our value is tied directly to how productive we are, right? That's the whole idea behind this, like being a productive member of society concept. And it's like an indication of what type of person you are. So someone who is productive is considered a good person who has their act together and they're living a life that's according to a standard that we're supposed to admire. But that type of thinking means that we have to constantly produce in order to have value as human beings. That means that our value isn't inherent, that it can increase or decrease based on our work and our productivity. So simply being a human is not enough. You have to like do stuff to earn your value. But the problem with that is, if for whatever reason you're not able to work because of disability or mental health or age or discrimination or inequality, what have you, then suddenly you don't have value, right? And society considers you worthless. And I think, as an aside, I was thinking about this, and I think that's one reason why society so often looks down upon the homeless and low income communities, because they're not earning enough money to be valuable. They're not being productive enough to be valuable, right?
Absolutely. And it's so I was going to say effed up, but it is. And it's absolutely true that we have this ingrained value judgments on people. And it's directly tied to their productivity. But unfortunately, the flip side is not true. Work is valuable and people should be compensated for the work they do, but it's compensation, right? So it's not, it's an exchange, right? It's a transaction. It's not a reflection of their worth as a human being, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think this is most clearly illustrated by artists who are expected to work for free. So it kind of irks me all the time, and I'm always sort of thinking about how bad this idea of talent is, because it obscures the amount of labor and the huge period of time that it takes to make an artist or an athlete. People whom we revere as a society because they're talented, quote unquote, have worked tirelessly for this their entire lives. Think of a classical pianist or a violinist who start their instrument before most of the world starts kindergarten. I remember as a kid in Romania, I wanted to start gymnastics when I was in grade 1, because gymnastics was huge in Romania, but it was way too late. Like, kids start gymnastics at 3 or 4. And that's how that's how actually very few of them end up being, the champions. And so when you say that that's because they're talented, it dismisses all that work, all the life of work that they've put into it, and because nobody is gifted from birth with nimble fingers, and that's what makes them play the piano so well, or nobody is gifted with amazing gross motor coordination, and that's why they skate so beautifully. And to say, oh, that's such talent, is to erase their lifetime of work, and to dismiss their labor at the same time. And dismissing the labor absolves society of the need to compensate it accordingly.
Yeah, it's this idea that the passion or the enjoyment that we get out of the work should be compensation enough.
Absolutely. And the dichotomy of love or money only shows how society thinks that if someone loves what they do or they're talented at it, their actual labor is its own reward. And we have such narratives in our society that starving artists produce the best work, or that you need to be depressed in order to create timeless art. And we embrace these toxic narratives because they absolve us as a society of both the responsibility, and the courage it takes to embrace of life as such tremendous labor without any guarantees of an actual livelihood. So, and what's more, the toxic seepage from this narrative has corroded our social imaginary of education. How many times have we heard that going in to study music or art or literature or history or any other humanities subject basically dooms you to penury? Or how we laugh at the perpetual scarecrow of the barista with a master's degree, while we turn our backs to, foreign trained doctors who drive taxis.
Yeah, you're so right. And it reminds me of an email that I got recently, sent by a person of color entrepreneur. And she was talking about how she'd been contacted by somebody who asked her to provide services for free, services that she normally charges for. So when she informed this someone of her fees, the response she got was, "Oh, I didn't realize you charge, and that's too expensive for me. Is there any other way you can do this for free?" And it's this idea that it's not just the artists and athletes, but people of color and immigrants and queer people and marginalized people in general are often expected to work with little or no compensation at all.
Yeah, exactly. And the pandemic has made this so clear. People who are trained in the humanities will tell you that there's an inextricable link between the social view of talent or vocation and the fact that our provincial government does not want to give healthcare workers or other frontline employees extra paid sick days. When you put all your efforts into pageantry around how much we value our frontline workers who are keeping things going while we white collar workers sit safely at home, putting up support posters on our windows or banging our pans in pots at 7 p.m. Every night. All this noise of this performativity hides the fact that our frontline workers are overworked and emotionally exhausted, and that they should be paid better and given the paid leaves they deserve, instead of us thinking that they do their jobs because they love the job so much that the job itself is its own compensation.
Yeah. Oh, I hate that so much. So much. Anyway, let's move on to our recommendation of the episode. Margaret, you've been reading a really interesting book on craft, right?
Yeah. Thank you for stopping my rant, and stopping me from going overboard. Yeah. So I have been reading a book on craft because all of us, so many of us, have had to reckon with how we work in this new situation. And so, luckily, both my endeavors, like teaching and writing, are prone to constant learning and interrogation of how we do things. So I read a lot of articles and books on how to teach and how to write. And my recommendation of the episode is a different kind of craft book, Matthew Salis's Craft in the Real World. takes on the entrenched Western understandings of what writerly craft is in order to advocate and make room for marginalized ways of telling stories. So it's definitely up our alley here at World of Stories.
Mm-hmm.
So Salesses, who was born in South Korea and adopted into a white American family at 2, talks about the history of the much lionized Iowa Writers Workshop, which was established in the 1930s with the clear mandate of spreading American style individualism through storytelling against a backdrop of, the communist threat.
Mm.
So he argues that all the well-known rules about writing can be traced back to the Iowa Writers Workshop. Things like write what you know and show, don't tell, and the story structure. So Salesses says, and I quote here, that to make craft accessible and inclusive, we must pull back the curtain on what craft is and does. We must reject the mystification and mythification of creative writing.
Okay, I can see where he's going with this. Does he talk about how we pull back the curtain?
Yeah. He proceeds to demystify craft by showing how the very particular style of writing upheld and taught by the Iowa Writers Workshop, which has its roots in Aristotle's Poetics and Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey, has for so long masqueraded as universal, when in fact it's always been the story of a white, straight, disabled man. Things like, as I mentioned, the character arc focused on the individual protagonist or the 3-act structure are all inventions particular to Western craft that have gained hegemony over all publishing and are used to silence any other kind of writing. So here's Salesses again, and I quote, "In contrast to the 3-act structure, Chinese, Korean, and Japanese stories have developed a 4-act rather than a 3 or 5-act structure. In Japanese, it's called Kishoten Ketsu. Ki for introduction, Sho for development, Ten for twist, and Ketsu for reconciliation." So where the Western fiction style relies on conflict, East Asian fiction uses surprise. Salesses offers some perspective on how the dominance of Western craft has led to Asian and African stories to be deemed as plotless or undramatic by Western critics, and therefore silenced by non-publication, right? Because you have to go through certain standards, quote unquote, in order to get published. And this is simply one example out of the whole book, which for me was quite the page turner. His robust writing and argumentation style kept me enthralled, and I'm I'm one of the choir he's preaching to, right? But I do hope people in publishing and education not only read this book, but also take his message to heart, so that we can enjoy truly diverse stories in content and structure.
Yeah, that book sounds amazing, and I've been very curious about other types of story structures that are not grounded in Western storytelling. So I'm definitely interested in this book. Thank you for the recommendation.
For sure.
So that is all for this episode. And if you would like to join the conversation, we would love for you to comment on our question of the episode, which is, how do you measure productivity? And alternatively, how do you put value on labor?
And again, you can let us know on Twitter at world_of_stories, or you can email us directly at worldofstoriespodcast@gmail.com. If you like our show, please share the podcast with your friends. You can rate and review World of Stories on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. The more reviews we get, the easier it will be for new listeners to find us.
And lastly, we have a new development for World of Stories. We now have a Ko-fi or coffee.
Woo-hoo!
Or Ko-fi. I don't know.
Or coffee. Or Ko-fi.
If you'd like to partner with us in our work and labor in producing the podcast, we'd appreciate every contribution, no matter how big or small. You can donate to World of Stories at See, this is the problem. I don't know how to say this word. ko-fi.com/World of Stories. That's ko-fi.com/World of Stories, which is all in one word. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time, stay safe.
And keep on humaning.